The problem I'd like to focus on today has become such a normalized one that now not only is it seen as the normal way of doing things, but also as the only way of doing things. And the problem I'm talking about is our access to medicines problem. More specifically, I want to focus in this presentation on how the system which brings us our medicines is broken and what we can do about it. Hi, my name is Swaraj Barooah, and I'll be speaking on open sourcing drug discovery. Let's start with perhaps everyone's most discussed topic for this year, that is COVID-19, of course. Now, there's naturally a race going on to cure and treat COVID, with more than 4,000 ongoing clinical trials around the world. While Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca have gotten drugs out, are in the news, several companies have a number of drugs and vaccines in the pipeline. Aside from this race for drugs though, what COVID has also done is manage to do something that public health activists have been trying to do for a very long time. That is, it has finally shown a spotlight on the broken public healthcare systems of the world. It's been approximately 1 year since COVID has been in the world today. Now, for merely indicative purposes, I've taken some common infectious diseases, a common type of cancer, and diarrheal diseases, which are also largely dependent on living conditions, environmental factors, etc. So my purpose here is not to compare misery and suffering, but rather to point out, okay, COVID is a new disease, we're still figuring this out, and the numbers are this bad, it makes sense. But all these other diseases have been around for decades. What is going on? TB, for example, tuberculosis, that is. It was declared a global health emergency by the WHO, by the World Health Organization, back in 1993. Almost 3 decades later, it is still taking more than 1 million deaths a year. And you can just look at the rest of these figures. Diarrheal diseases has incidences of more than 6 billion a year, and still has a death rate of approximately the same as COVID-19. And this has also been going on for decades. So what is going on? In fact, the sad truth is the world is not only unprepared for diseases that it knows about as clear and present dangers, but on top of that, it also has to deal with unexpected disease outbreaks as well. Looking back over the last 10 years, there's an average of maybe 100+ disease outbreaks every year. And those are, of course, only the ones that are recorded to and responded to by the WHO. So that's looking back. What about looking forwards? As several top scientists and researchers have been pointing out, this is not going to be the last major outbreak, even within our lifetimes. That is scary. Now, the reasons may vary. There's too much unsustained growth where humans are coming into contact with animal life that has lived separately till now, melting of ice caps, potentially releasing viruses that have been dormant for thousands of years, various reasons. Okay, so now we have a sense of the scale and significance of the problem, and COVID has highlighted it, but is not nearly the only cause of concern. So what do we do about this? There are a few different areas that can be focused on, but for the purposes of this presentation, I want to focus on the system which brings us our medicines, to point out that the drugs we're getting and the price we're getting them at is being caused by a faulty system, and there's something that can and should be changed about this. And the system I'm talking about is our patent system. What are patents? They are rights over inventions that are novel, non-obvious, and which have industrial use. These rights, of course, allow patent holders to prevent others from making this same patented invention. So looking at patents for pharmaceuticals specifically, the standard reason or the justification which is given is that pharmaceutical innovation is very expensive, lots of resources and time to come up with a new drug, whereas it is much cheaper to reverse engineer the same drug. So, to incentivize companies into making new drugs, they are given these exclusive rights. Now, this all sounds fine on paper, but indicatively, a few years ago, back in 2013 or 14, Bayer's CEO let slip a widely acknowledged but unspoken truth of the industry. That is, these medicines are being made for markets, not for health. Now, the quote which I put here, this is saying that we did not develop this medicines for Indians, we developed it for Western patients who can afford it. He later clarified that he misspoke this, he didn't mean this, etc. But this truth still fundamentally remains. That is to say that the only legal obligations pharmaceutical companies have is to their shareholders. This does not make them evil. It makes them companies. This is the truth we need to deal with. So, when we link health benefits to market signals, what do we get? Firstly, why should companies prevent when they can focus on curing? So, an example, why focus on a vaccine when you can just continue to treat the disease? You'll essentially wipe out your market if you put out a successful vaccine. Of course, COVID is a different situation where there's already a guaranteed market and there's a lot of other goodwill factors and whatnot involved. But as a general principle, it doesn't make sense to wipe out your market before when you can instead just continue to treat them over generations. Secondly, if markets are incentivizing your solutions will be market-based. This is obvious. And the best example of this is what is popularly known in the literature as the humble checklist example. So here what happened is, hospitals in US realized that thousands of patients were getting infections upon coming to these hospitals. So while some companies started proposing in-depth new antibiotic responses, someone in one of these hospitals realized that this was being caused because doctors and nurses were not washing their hands enough between patients. So the solution? They implemented an SOP, a standard operating procedure, which mandated hand washes. And they stuck these up in the emergency rooms and other areas and mandated that doctors and nurses follow these SOPs. And suddenly, what did you see? Infection rates plummeted. So, right, that's one example of what happens when you focus on cure rather than prevention. Second, duplicative or wasteful research are also evergreening problems. When companies realize that one drug can bring them a lot of money, they tend, and it makes business sense, to keep trying to extend the patent over that drug. How do they do this? By making minor modifications and getting a new patent, extending the monopoly by another 20 years. Similarly, other companies also waste their resources trying to get into this pot of money. They also want a hand in this pot, instead of trying to make new useful drugs. Third, neglected diseases. So when diseases that especially affect the global poor, and these tend to be in the global south usually, why should companies bother making a drug since most of the patients won't be able to afford it anyway? Fourth, even when there's a target audience, even when there's a big enough target audience to make money back, it still makes more business sense to focus on richer patients. Bill Gates gave a famous example where he pointed out that more money was going into treating male pattern baldness than malaria, since old white men had a lot more to spend than patients with malaria in poor countries. And then, of course, there are several other related reasons, such as higher focus on marketing and PR rather than R&D, investing in smaller corporates instead of investing in R&D. I won't get into these for the purposes of this slide. Now, COVID has brought into focus a lot of these issues. And academic journals were sharing information like never before. Scientists were sharing data like never before. It was understood this is not the time to withhold vital information, especially since this could lead to actually addressing this crisis. For once, collaboration was placed over standard business practices. However, that aside, it was still not enough. IP barriers were still blocking certain progress. And so, India and South Africa, in the last couple of weeks, that's in November, brought a motion to the World Trade Organization to suspend a number of IP provisions for the duration of the pandemic. So what happened to this proposal? Well, it played out like this. More than 100 countries ended up supporting it, but in the WTO, you need a unanimous consensus to pass the motion through, and industry and politics lobbying eventually won out. You can see in the map that Global South nearly unanimously wanted this proposal, whereas Global North countries almost all were not in favor of this. Okay, so the system is broken, and industry lobbying and politics means it will continue to be hard to fix. So what now? Well, there are two structural changes that are clearly needed, right? First, delink the R&D costs from the final selling price of the drug. Or second, reduce the cost of the R&D in the first place. Does it really need to be this high? So this brings me to the proposed solution that I'm focusing on in this presentation. One of the proposed solutions, that is. And it's called open source drug discovery. You can think of it as Linux for drugs. It's an open, collaborative system which is more attuned to health needs, and it ends up being a lot cheaper. There are different variations of this, but in simple terms, you can think of it as Linux, but in the pharmaceutical field. Of course, there are other more material concerns which come into picture, because this is not just software which needs to be done. So I'll get into exactly how this works in a bit. But first, conceptually, does this address the patent-related problems that I brought up earlier? Yes. As soon as the market focus is removed, it no longer makes sense to focus on the cure rather than prevention. The question of trying to get another patent on a drug that you already made doesn't come up if there are no patents in the first place. And then the target audience's health concerns are more important than their wallets. So some pioneers of this concept of open source drug discovery, there's some academic papers back in 2005, 2006, two institutional approaches in 2008, 2011, a little over a decade ago. Slowly, with time, more and more attempts are being made in this direction, and it's being seen as a more and more viable option. The two examples I want to speak about are the CSIR OSDD program, that is the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, the Government of India's scientific labs. They started an OSDD, that is Open Source Drug Discovery Program, in 2008, and is perhaps the first large-scale one by a government. And they did it with the intention of focusing on TB and malaria as the prime targets. It's had quite a bit of success so far. Currently, more than 7,900 participants are participating in this over 130 countries. So how does this work? Okay, briefly. First, projects or ideas are posted by any community member on Sysborg. Sysborg is their online collaboration forum. You have to register, anyone can register, and then you get on there and you can start this process. The community there then reviews these projects or ideas. Next, a principal investigator, and these are usually experienced scientists and the like, they will take responsibility for the project or idea and go and secure necessary funding from CSIR's government grants. The government has put aside about $35 million for this, and they're slowly releasing this over time. Now the community collaborates on the projects and produces their output, their results, and these are typically maintained in the form of laboratory notebooks. And these are made available on the Sysborg platform for the community to review. Members then provide input on project monitoring and quality control. Here what happens is an unstated but usual practice is that these results are published in a peer-reviewed journal. So that is all the early stage. From there on, lead optimization and beyond, public sector institutes and contract research organizations with the necessary expertise are brought in as partners. And the results of their work will also be available on the portal for community review and input. Next is a very expensive part of the process, which is clinical trials. This is proposed to be supported with public funds following international regulations and protocols. Now, once it's approved by regulatory authorities, the product is released for generics to manufacture without any patents covering this. So there are no licensing fees, no royalties, just market competition on an unpatented product. So till date, it's had a good amount of success, that it's reannotated the TB genome, and a generation of 11 models for prediction of anti-tuberculosis activity has also been performed. It also had a number of side benefits, which I've listed out over here. The next example I want to give is the Open Source Pharma Foundation. Now this is a slightly different situation. They started in 2018, just 2 years ago. And what have they done in that time? They've already commenced a multicentric phase 2B clinical trial for an adjunct therapy for tuberculosis. Now this is incredible. They've reached a stage in 1 year. It usually takes more than 10 years to reach this stage. Next, they've done this at a cost of less than $50,000. And this is remarkable if you consider that the industry accepted estimate for a new drug cost is $2.6 billion. So how have they done this? Aside from focusing on massive open online research or CSIR's sort of crowdsourcing approach, they've also focused on drug repurposing. Of course, this has its limitations, with less than 20% of existing drugs being fit for repurposing. But what repurposing allows is when a drug is already in existence and off patent, it opens up a number of other possibilities and reduces expenses by a lot. Nonetheless, the larger ambition and goals of the open source Pharma Foundation is also to offer a platform where biomedical projects can be floated, crowd researched, and produced. Here, for example, AI can be harnessed to pull insights from data scraped from the web. Okay, so again, we have clinical trials, which are a bit of an issue when it comes to funding. So clinical trials will once again require external funds. And so it's a sort of a work in progress. The larger point, however, is that this open source approach can have vast benefits and ones that are increasingly going to be needed in the future. So with this, I'm hitting my time limit. So to conclude, I hope this has provided a glimpse into what I truly believe is an innovative approach to a global problem, one that is a lot fairer to people everywhere, including the global south, the global poor, and one that can use more supporters, more peers, and more appreciation. Thank you.